Okay, so there are a couple different paradigms that I was exposed to growing up in the West. Um, First, coming from a Christian background, is you know, life is to be lived in a certain way, not necessarily to be enjoyed, uh, but lived in a certain way for a reward after life. The enjoyment, the um, peace, the bliss that's kind of associated with heaven, not necessarily on earth. That's like one paradigm. Another paradigm is um, this idea of enjoying life here, um, but it's still somewhat limited, I would say, kind of limited to the experiences that sensory pleasure can give us, and then perhaps also love is kind of seen as like the, you know, possibly like highest experience one can have. But I was exposed to this notion of enlightenment that is, talked about in the East, enlightenment or nirvana or moksha, this idea that while you're alive, you can achieve, like extreme inner freedom. And I was wondering if you could, elaborate on that, like explain what does that really mean? I mean, that we're given all sorts of ideas here. I mean, like, it's a binary situation where you're one way and then boom, all of a sudden it's like the Buddha and you attain nirvana, and is that just like extreme inner freedom, bliss, and happiness? Do you get unbelievable abilities? I mean, like what is this? What's the truth about this idea? There's so much around it, so many ideas and emotions around this idea. But I was wondering, from your perspective, what is around this idea of self-realization, nirvana, moksha, enlightenment, all these different terms that seem to point to the same idea of attaining a state of freedom.
When we talk about nirvana and moksha, like you said, it is usually quite difficult to relate to from a sensory pleasure perspective, because the way we understand happiness in the world is something pleasant happens, and whether it's something for the body, sex or whatever it is, and it's a nice experience because your senses are heightened, or the sensory enjoyment really accumulates and you feel good. Whenever this idea of enlightenment is presented, it is confusing when the only paradigm we are used to is our sensory paradigm. So in answer to your question, what is this enlightenment, and what heightened experience can we really have while alive on this earth, and does it match, and I'm adding words to your question, but does it match the apparent bliss we were supposed to attain after reaching heaven, while on earth itself, through enlightenment? And the answer is, enlightenment is the experience where the part of you that perceives, the part of you that actually experiences, that part is now disconnected from thought. And thought, or the mind, is seen as the liaison to the external world. Before this point, before one reaches this state, before one reaches enlightenment, our normal state is that our experience is completely tied to thought, which thereby means our experience is tied to whatever happens outside, since thought reflects essentially what happens outside. So, enlightenment, and why it's called moksha or freedom, is because it says that the part of us that experiences, the part of us that is true and permanent, that part is no longer a slave to the outside. Now, when that is achieved, you can see how no matter what happens on the outside, no matter if it's a good situation or a bad situation, there is a part, the part of us that experiences is unaffected. So there is peace even in chaotic times, there is happiness even in unhappy times, and there is this freedom and independence of one's experience that is maintained no matter what we go through. And that is what enlightenment is. These different schools and different religions and different perspectives will describe it slightly different. They might have more of a spiritual twist to it, but if you really explore their descriptions and what that state really is, it'll come down to this basic point, that your awareness is separate from thought, which is a liaison to the world, which is why you're calm and in a happy state and in a free state for all time. So that is what enlightenment is, and that is why those pleasant things are associated with enlightenment.
Okay. Is there anything, after enlightenment? I mean, what happens when one becomes enlightened? I mean, first, is that like an event?
It can be. See, for certain people, based on their belief structure, based on their understanding through their mind of reality, of what they expect, all of a sudden, if their experience has, in whatever way, whatever their method was, whether meditation or something, resulted in their experience being separate from thought, it could come with a dramatic kind of it could come with a dramatic experience of like, oh, like I feel one with the world, or I feel this, or I feel that, and that all of that is related to the perspective one had just before, and now the fact that the perspective is so different. So that kind of contrast can make one feel like it is an event sometimes. Some other times it could be very mundane, but it just gets noticed later on when one sees that, oh wow, like nothing really is affecting. No matter what happens, I'm still quite aware, I'm quite calm, I'm quite alert, and nothing is affecting. So it could also be like that. So it doesn't have to be an event, but you can see how sometimes it is if the belief structure was so intense before with regards to what they expected and everything, and so it could just seem that way from the contrast.
Okay. Do people have to want or try to be in this state? Can it happen inadvertently? Or is it only achieved from self-effort from the individual?
See, the state of enlightenment, like I said, and that's why I described it as awareness separating out from thought, because enlightenment can usually gets associated a lot of time just with the effects and with all the hoopla of it's bliss and it's this and that. So when we understand enlightenment as just this separation of awareness from thought, what you can see is it is possible to achieve that state even if you're not trying to achieve it, as long as one is quite aware of the fact that they are not thought, or for some reason they became aware of it or something and they reached that state. It is possible that, and there are stories in Indian, some of the Indian texts and all that, that there are these people who just did their work, did their duties for their families and all of that, but they did it with absolutely zero expectation of the results. And what resulted was that their awareness never really went towards thought, and it was always within itself, and before you know it, they were in the state. They weren't necessarily trying to be in that state, but they were so one-pointed in doing their duty that they seemed to achieve that state. So there are stories like that as well. But now since we are talking about it, might as well give an effort to reach it. And effort means, okay, now that I know that that state is achievable, and it seems superior to being affected by everything that happens on the outside, I might as well try to reach that state. I mean, that's whoever is listening to this and aware of it, so might as well try to go towards it. But yes, theoretically it is possible to inadvertently get to it.
So then, I mean, this is it's kind of an obvious next question, but like, what are the different ways of going about, becoming enlightened, for lack of a better question?
Look, in the East, that is the central theme of religion, actually. Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, it's a way of life. And that way of life is centered around independence. Perception of independence is the number one thing. God, absence of God, agnosticism towards God, perception of God as energy rather than a deity, all of that are different paths, different approaches one can take. But the central theme is freedom of one's awareness. That is the central theme. And to then have that reflect onto our lives, our expressions, our actions. That's why in Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism, there is this, extremely important tenet which says all paths lead to the same goal. So those who are truly Hindu, and that's why many people who would be kicked out of other countries for many, many centuries, whether it's Jews or any other religion, would come to India, because those who are Hindu in that nation and who were truly Hindu, and especially at that time they were well aware of what it meant to be Hindu, they knew all paths led to the same goal and let them all come in. And it's because everything in the texts centered around how do you get to that goal. And religions of Jainism, Buddhism, many religions that came out of Hinduism were just different paths where they concentrated on certain different lifestyle choices and different philosophical choices, but the goal was essentially still the same, which is of enlightenment, moksha. So when you ask what are the different ways that you go about it, even Christianity, even many Hindus, most Hindus, if they're truly Hindu, they believe Christ exists. I used to be asked in college often. I went to college in the States. I used to be asked often by Christians or whomever, missionaries, do you believe in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? And I would say, yes, of course I believe. Also, you're Christian. No, I'm Hindu. Wait, how can you be Hindu and how can you still believe? It isn't one. I don't like this word belief, but the point is that all paths, even Christianity, there is a way to follow it such that you reach that goal. But it has to be done such that you account for awareness, you account for the mind. And so, to answer what are the different ways in which you can go about it, the best way for me to answer it is in terms of yoga. There is this term called yoga. It means union. It's one of the schools of thought in Indian philosophy. But I like to give that as an example because it has nice practical implications. So we have 4 methods, 4 schools in yoga. One is called Bhakti Yoga. That is the yoga of devotion. Yoga just means union. It's describing that final state. Bhakti Yoga is typically what these religions that we know of in the world, they are essentially trying to follow Bhakti Yoga, but they don't necessarily know that their goal is yoga. So many of them just get stuck in the dogmatic aspect and the aspect that, oh, my God is more true than your God, and just get stuck there. And even some paths within Hinduism who are, these kind of bhakti paths get stuck in that. The goal of all religions, if you believe in a deity, is to achieve that state. So bhakti yoga, through devotion, it is possible to achieve it. If you truly are allowing your awareness to identify with that deity, then you can achieve that state if you're committed to that. So it's called bhakti yoga. Second is Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga, Raja means royal, king, but Raja Yoga means royal path. We have heard of Hatha Yoga, yoga studios all around this country or even in other countries in the West. Hatha Yoga is actually from Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is essentially meditation, using pranayama, breath control, good asanas, positioning, to the purpose of being able to concentrate and then get into meditative states. That is a way. In Buddhism, they use that meditation as a very important way by which one can possibly achieve that state. So that is one yoga. The third one is called karma yoga. That's the one I was referring to earlier. Karma means action, where you do your duties, but you're not putting attention on the results. When you do that continuously, the idea is you're able to separate your awareness from thought, from expectation, from results. And the fourth one is Jnana Yoga. Jnana means knowledge, but another term is Buddhi Yoga, that is yoga of the intellect. So you're using an understanding. The teacher gives an understanding, an accurate description of the nature of the mind to the student understands it, and by understanding it, the student is able to separate his or her awareness from thought. So these are the four main yoga methods. Again, there are other different paths, but I like to describe it in terms of these four methods of yoga because it's relatable and it accounts for the different tendencies that we have. Now, I answered this question from the perspective of what are the ways in which one can go about, just to give you a more kind of academic answer of what is potentially out there. If you were to ask me, given our lives in the world right now, given how we do things, and if someone living in this world, working in this world, having family in this world, wants to achieve this state because they see truth in achieving that state and they want to feel that experience of freedom while still alive, I would tell them, given this time, I would follow the yoga of the intellect. Why? Because I have taught meditation for many years, and whether here or India or wherever, and one thing that is true is, given our lifestyle and our mindset, it is quite difficult to find people who are able to adopt the practice of meditation while still living in the world and doing their duties. Does not seem very realistic. And so with Jnana Yoga, because we're so used to using our intellect and understanding things, that is something people are able to relate to, catch on, follow, and execute. So I would say the best way is to try to understand the nature of the mind, and in that way treat the mind accurately rather than just being overwhelmed by the mind. And by doing that, it is possible to separate one's awareness from thought.
Do you need to give up the rest of your life, change your lifestyle completely to do this? Or
you don't need to change your lifestyle, but what you do need to change is your conviction of your goals in life. If you still believe that achieving certain things can give you some peace, can give you some cushion in life, can give you some sort of positive experience that can help you move through life, then you will not completely give all the effort and the priority and importance required to separating your awareness from thought. You will still, it's like having feet in both, both inside and outside. You're not one way or the other. In order to do this, you have to be committed and be convinced that no matter how you cut it, if you believe in the world, if you believe in thought, you are always going to be in misery eventually. There might be nice times where things are relatively fine, but eventually the world fluctuates, experiences fluctuate, and we cannot trust experience, no matter how hard you try. That conviction has to be there. That's why in India, typically, if you're a young person and you're going to the section of the bookstore or of the library where you have all these texts on enlightenment, the older people will be like, "You're young. Why are you here? Only old people are supposed to be here because they're frustrated with life and they're saturated with life. What are you doing here?" It's not about age. It's about your conviction. Even old people sometimes still want to have sex and live their life. I mean, it's not about age. It's about your conviction. And the conviction can come when you're young, the conviction can come when you're old. But that conviction is important. That conviction that no matter how you cut it, you are just not going to be able to get peace and get happiness while believing in the world, while living with thought. If you have that conviction, you can still let duties go on, you can still live your life in the world, but that conviction will allow you to give the importance that this process deserves and requires. Enlightenment also is not a spiritual thing, meaning spiritual is so attached with religion and with God, deities and all that. And in Buddhism they talk about enlightenment and they're essentially agnostic, and it's just at the end of the day, it is, you can, if you want to consider deities and all that, you can consider that, and that is also a path one can follow if one wants to be enlightened that way, but you don't need to. Enlightenment is it's a very personal experience. It is not about God, it is not about spirit. It can be if you want it to be, if that's the path you would like it to be, but it is not about that. Enlightenment is very relevant, and unfortunately it gets presented as if it does not matter to normal people living in the world because it's just some spiritual fantasy. No. And of course Buddhism and modern Buddhists do try to communicate this point, but this point also has to be communicated such that it's clear. It also does not have to be something that is only that only meditators, those who are really into meditation, can achieve. You don't have to be spiritual, you don't necessarily have to be a meditator. But enlightenment is relevant to everyone, because one day or the other you are going to see that thought, the world, is unreliable when it comes to permanent peace and permanent happiness. Unreliable. It is the most relevant experience to everyone. Everyone wants it. Depression, all of those things is just the recognition that life as we live it is not enough. The only solution is not some short-term stuff that can make you forget things for a while. Whether it be drug or even yoga meditation used for the purpose of relief. The only solution is the long-term overhaul of our experience, of our perspective. And that is why enlightenment is being spoken about here, and that is why enlightenment is relevant.
How do you think again, coming from a Western perspective, how do you think our notions, our understanding of psychology and, like, do they even account for something like this, or is this even, does that contradict, or from an Eastern perspective, like, would you even, is there anything like accurate or correct about like our field of psychology here, or like what is the use of that? Because it seems like these spiritual practices, or this ancient knowledge of the mind, somehow overlaps that field. So
See, my understanding, again, I don't want to overstep my bounds in terms of completely describing therapy and psychologists, but at the same time, what I do want to communicate is, from my understanding, psychology and the field of psychology is more linked to helping us manage our lives, where it tries to give some sort of a perspective on why we do what we do and why certain things happen and how we can navigate through it. And it's more of a maintenance, more for us to kind of come to terms with things. So it definitely helps a lot of people, because many people don't have the ability to have that perspective themselves. So many people, when they go to therapists, it does give them that ability to manage things. But as it pertains to getting rid of that life of believing in the world and going through the fluctuations of the world, it does not attempt to do that. Psychology does not attempt to do that. Whereas these things do. I mean, Sanatana Dharma and all that, the goal is to get enlightened, to remove your conviction that you are thought. Psychology isn't trying to do that. Psychology is just allowing you to manage your experience and maintains that you are a person who has traits. But in this, the idea is, no, you are not thought, you are not these traits, you are not any of these things, you are that which is separate from it. Remove your attention from all of these fluctuations. So they're not really trying to do the same thing.
So you say we are not thought. So we have a body. What else are we?
So we have a body, and through this body, thought is generated, and an experience of thoughts and an experience of sensations that one can feel through the body is perceived. Now, when we talk about what else are we, instead of answering this question from a philosophical perspective of there is such a thing called a soul, and there is a soul and there is a body, and we are the soul that is permanent, and not just this Western notion of soul, which is essentially just personality, but not just of body, not even that kind of soul or any kind of soul. I'm not going to go there. Better way to talk about it is, if we look at our own experience, instead of thinking of it philosophically, if you think of our own experience, we have awareness. We have the ability to perceive. There is this ability. Okay? There is also something called thought. Now, there is the possibility of being aware or experiencing, while at the same time that experience not always following thought. So it is possible to get to a state where you are experiencing something, you're aware of something, but that experience and awareness is different from thought. The fact that you're able to achieve such a thing implies and points to the fact that there is some part of you that is separate from thought. Now, of Of course, a skeptic can say, well, that's just another thought. It's just a thought that tells itself, oh, it's some observer, some neutral, independent observer. That is also nothing but thought. But I promise you, talking from personal experience, it is 100% possible to achieve this state where you really are able to see thought, all thought, even thought masquerading as an observer, as separate from your awareness, from that which perceives. You feel the difference, you perceive the difference. This isn't some, it is like saying, well, how do you know the difference between land and water? I know what is land and I know what is water. Like, I'm not an idiot. It's the same thing. It is possible to reach a state where you're still aware, you're still perceiving something, and thought is not related to that perception. So, in answer to your question, what else is there other than the body? Well, there is an awareness or a perceiver that is separate from that which happens in the mind/body. That is for sure. And that one can experience.
What about for people that aren't necessarily aware of this idea? You keep referring to the world. Let's say they're completely caught up in the world. Maybe it's a friend or a loved one. Is that just a process they have to go to? They have to become disillusioned in a sense. They have to go through like hardships in order to recognize that freeing oneself from thought is the only realistic option for them.
It's all degrees. Like, you don't, like we're saying, right, like, you don't need to be 60 years old or 70 years old to be saturated with life, because even young people, to whatever extent, they do experience enough things where they have perceived saturation or perceived emptiness in the world, or in the experiences that they go through. But if one is able to articulate to someone who has had even some sort of saturation, it doesn't have to be like unbelievable depression or they're just completely fed up with life, they've been beat down and they have nothing. They don't need to be in such a desperate state. Even if they have some acknowledgement or recognition that, yeah, like, at the end of the day, no matter how we cut it, there is always misery that eventually comes through, and there is always struggle. As long as that is acknowledged, they will have the openness to say, okay, I'm willing to kind of give it a chance that it is possible to be in a state where I don't have to be such a slave, or I'm not always looking over my shoulder to see what's going to happen next. It is possible to communicate to such people the possibility of enlightenment, such that they can get to that conviction that it is worth moving towards that. But they need to have some sort of an acknowledgement of the emptiness that the world presents. If they don't, then they cannot have that openness to listen to this and to see the relevance of it.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of this knowledge? I mean, it's not necessarily from Hinduism, but it's also generally associated with the East, particularly India. How far back does this go? Like, what is the if you wanted to give a synopsis of the practices and the understanding of enlightenment, like what is the history, I guess.
Look, I'm pretty sure that all cultures, in some way or the other, have perceived the possibility of achieving a heightened mental state while alive. And different cultures, talk about it in different ways. And it is possible some other ancient cultures, old cultures, have talked about it way back when and had methods towards it, but it got lost. What I am aware of, when we talk about the East, we talk about India, we talk about Hinduism. See, Sanatan Dharma, in some form or the other, has been there for a very, very long time, which is what is called Hinduism, because of the Indus Valley, they call it Hinduism. But Sanatan Dharma, for the longest time, even in the oldest texts, which have been dated, there's all these varying dates, but way back BC, it's just, I don't want to give numbers that modern archaeologists will debate with. It does not matter. What is relevant for the discussion is, as far as I am aware, this in Sanatan Dharma in Hinduism, you have these stories and these accounts of these particular people called rishis or sages who wanted to expand their awareness and see the limits of it, and they treated it the same way we have science and scientific method here in the West and now in the whole world towards understanding physical reality, where you experiment, you open to all possibilities, and you try to understand what is the nature of it. That there was a similar approach as it pertained to one's own experience, one's own awareness, and to understand the limits of it. Like I said, it's possible other countries also had people who did it. So I can talk about India and Sanatan Dharma because I'm aware of it, and in that there are definitely accounts of these people doing it in texts that are dated way back when. And in that, they're trying through different methods to achieve that state, and those are the different methods that are talked about in all these different texts. And again, like I say, time and time again, you see in Sanatan Dharma the emphasis given to this state, because it is seen as only after achieving this state are you essentially a person. Till then, you are nothing but a leaf blowing in the wind. You in order to have clarity, in order to have experience, in order to be someone who's sovereign, who's independent, you need to achieve this state. And so the importance of this state is always emphasized, is quite emphasized in all these texts. And that is, in essence, the history of enlightenment and the importance of it. And there are schools in Hinduism who are atheist. Schools in Hinduism that I said are agnostic or this or that. But at the end of the day, are materialistic. But at the end of the day, the point is, that's why when people tell me, some people tell me, oh, I'm a Hindu, but now I'm no longer Hindu, I'm atheist. I say they're not related. You being an atheist does not mean you're not a Hindu. Being a Hindu means you wish to achieve that personal freedom. That personal freedom has no bearing on whether or not you think a God exists or not. Right? It has no bearing on. That has no bearing on this. It's about personal freedom. Perceiving that. Being free from everything that can influence your experience, your perception. So, as far as I'm aware, that is the history of enlightenment. This achievement of personal freedom, the importance of it is stated, and over the years, different people have explored different paths that are consistent with many of the paths listed in all these books, and they have their own little different method, and those are listed. And even in India today, you will have many different gurus who come up who are apparently enlightened, and they will expound on the stuff that they did that helped them achieve that state. Now, many a time you see that those gurus have a lot of followers, and they always use the term cult to describe them, because many Indians, bhakti yoga is their chosen path, and you can have bhakti towards your guru, you can have bhakti towards the deity. Many of them choose to have bhakti towards the guru, and it comes across as cultish. They don't care. As long as they're able to achieve whatever state, they are going to do what they want to do. But that is who these gurus are. Essentially, people who have apparently achieved these states and are teaching other people on how to do it. So that, I don't know if that's exactly what you asked, but this is as far as I know in terms of the point of enlightenment and how enlightenment has been talked about in the different texts in Sanatana Dharma and Hinduism.
Are there different gurus for each of the different types of yoga that you talked about?
I don't know about each yoga has like 7 gurus or 8. It's not. I don't know if it's not like that. It's just that the different gurus would have their, they'll have their path of comfort or choice or whatever they used, whatever they have more clarity on, they will expound on. Some gurus would have used multiple paths within it and would be able to talk about all these multiple paths. But yeah, again, I just talked about it in terms of yoga. You can come at it even in terms of tantra, and some people even call it tantra yoga. Tantra is a different school. So there are other schools as well. Please don't misunderstand this to say that these are the only paths. I just talked about the different paths of yoga. There are different schools and there are different paths within that as well, and there are other gurus of those paths as well.
Is that always the form that this takes? Like someone learning from a teacher? I mean, is it always?
Not necessarily. One can, explore it on their own, and there are examples of people who've read some book or read something or gotten inspiration from something, and then it triggers them to really go on this path and find it and figure it out for themselves. But the point of having a teacher is the same reason we have teachers, to learn about physical reality. It's just, if there's a good teacher and they're knowledgeable, they're able to cut down on the time required, and they're able to communicate to us of all the different books available. This is the essential information. This is the thing that you need to focus on. Given your strengths, focus on chemistry, not on physics. Similarly, in this, it's like, okay, given your tendencies, follow this path or follow that path. They're able to do all of that. And so having a guru, more than anything, almost just reduces the time, makes the process more efficient, and increases the chances that you continue on, because you're able to progress quicker.
So, I mean, are most enlightened people like, in the public, or like what is the, do some of them just, hide away in the cave somewhere? Like what's the, I mean, I'm in public like all these teachers,
Right.
these gurus. But
No, I don't think it's a one-on-one, if that's what you mean. If you're enlightened, that means you need to be a teacher. I'm sure there are many enlightened people who are still in the world, still do their thing in the world. There are enlightened people who are gurus, and some popular, some not as popular. There are some enlightened people who got enlightened while they were in the caves, and then remain in the caves, remain in isolation. There are some who weren't in the caves, got enlightened, and then went to the caves. I'm sure there's such a large variation. There's no one-to-one that you need to be a teacher, but many enlightened ones eventually do become, not, I mean, again, many is a very subjective term, but there are a decent number of ones, if one is to observe, that do end up teaching in some form or the other. Maybe just to a couple of people, maybe to a huge group of people, but just because, some people get attracted to them, they're able to see that there is some difference in their behavior, some clarity, and then they approach them and ask them questions and want to be like them, and so they eventually end up getting some students. But also, one thing I want to clarify is that enlightenment is usually thought of and presented in this very 1-0 way of, okay, either you're not enlightened or you're enlightened, and after you're enlightened, okay, you've gotten a golden pass and then that's it. But actually, the point about what enlightenment refers to is the separation of awareness from thought. Okay, that marks the difference between someone who's enlightened, just to use a term so that we can relate, versus someone who isn't. But that person who has separated their awareness from thought, now how much of awareness are they able to are they aware of? There are so many different aspects in awareness. There are depths within awareness, and if you really look at it, I would look at it as a continuous spectrum. There are people who are apparently not enlightened, and then this particular state comes, which is apparently called enlightenment because it seems to be significantly different from the states before that, so we need to call it something different. But then there is still a continuation. And even those who are enlightened, there is almost this not infinite but close to infinite process of still exploring that which is awareness and seeing the different aspects of it, accessing the different aspects of it. And that's why even in Sanatana Dharma and Hinduism, and even in the West, we have these concepts of incarnations of God, right? Like Jesus Christ, or even Buddha to an extent. And in Hinduism, you have Krishna, Rama, all that. And all these people are seen very different from enlightened sages. And if you really explore deeply, you can see that the level to which these incarnations are able to let things happen and able to be established in their awareness while still allowing the world to take place around them and really immerse themselves in the world, you see that they're in different states than the enlightened sages even. So there is almost this continuous spectrum when we talk about states that one can be in awareness. There is this continuous spectrum, and enlightenment is a stage and a state worth acknowledging, but there are still more states that one can keep exploring and one can keep going into.
And are there I mean, how does this factor into you mentioned that it wasn't necessarily spiritual, it wasn't necessarily religious, but what is the idea of life after death? Or obviously reincarnation is the significant belief of many people in Eastern religions. Does that
Look, when we're talking about enlightenment and the focus is on enlightenment, I would say that the focus should be on one's personal experience, one's personal perception, how far in the process of separating one's awareness from thought are we able to go, and once we do that, how much further are we able to go. That should be the focus, because it's a very personal experience, it's an actual experience, and it's something you can do and something you can be in. And that is what I would suggest the focus is on. And many a time people do want to understand philosophically what is true. Is it true that we are something other than the body, that is this thing called a soul, and in the East the notion of a soul is slightly different from that of the West, and in the East there is this idea of the soul can keep getting reborn. Yeah, I mean, we can go into those philosophical conceptions, and there is truth to that. Again, from my own personal experience, I have been able to perceive these aspects of the soul and all of that is spoken about. I have been able to perceive those things, and it is consistent with what is said. The experience is consistent with what is said, but I would prefer to not dwell on all of those things, because you can just get caught up in that philosophy, and what is the relevance of it? At the end of the day, if you're not able to separate your awareness from thought, all of that is irrelevant. And if you are able to separate your awareness from thought, how is that relevant? How does that matter? Who cares then? A very great saint from India, whose name was Swami Vivekananda, who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s, had said this statement: if God doesn't exist, what is the point of the world? And if God does exist, what is the point of the world? I would say this same point in terms of what I just said. But if you are able to separate your awareness from thought, who cares about anything else? In terms of philosophy, in terms of whatever happens, happens. If you're able to do it. But if you're able to do that, that's what matters.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how so many questions can be philosophical, and I guess this is somewhat not directly related to pragmatism, but like, you know, you also hear about other like cities or like other things like that these Indian saints can, you know, they can perceive things that most people can't. Is that also true, or like what's the?
See, Siddhis, I mean, Siddha means he who is perfect. Siddhi means that which emanates from someone who is perfect. Okay, that's what the term Siddhi means. Commonly, it is meant to refer to supernatural powers, which is what you are asking. And in terms of it being true, personally, I myself have seen things happen even in this own system and in some others, through some others, where it cannot be explained just from a material perspective, or you know, just world perspective. But again, the focus should not be on that stuff. It should not be on trying to achieve that, because if one is just trying to achieve siddhis, there is these powers, it can actually be achieved while still not achieving enlightenment. It is possible, but it is such a distraction. It is possible. I know people who have done that but not achieved the state of enlightenment. You can ask how is it possible? Siddhis are supposed to come only from siddhas. No, if you just focus on one aspect of awareness such that a certain thing can be done, then you can achieve it. But again, these things are distractions, and I wouldn't dwell on it. But yes, for your curiosity, the answer is yes. Those things are real.